A Roman official opened a file on Christians in Bithynia and found Jesus named in a way that gave the movement no protection. The people involved were not defending a church, and they were not trying to prove a resurrection. They were reporting disturbances, punishments, and a Jewish teacher executed under Pontius Pilate. Grok was asked to remove every Christian source and count only the outsiders. It surfaced Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, and a dispute over which words Josephus actually wrote. What does Tacitus really prove? Which sentence in Josephus was altered by a later Christian hand? And why did Pliny ask an emperor how to punish people who sang to Christ as to a god? Jesus of Nazareth, about 33, Jerusalem, Passover around 30 CE, stands at the center of the file. If you want the record behind the record, stay with the names and dates. The enemies kept the best records. But the first Roman report is not where the story begins. 3 witnesses, none of them Christian. That is the whole dossier, and it is smaller than most sermons admit, and far harder to dismiss than most skeptics expect. The outsiders who kept the file. That is where this begins. Not with a gospel, not with a creed, not with a pulpit, with 3 men who wrote about Jesus of Nazareth while wanting nothing good for the people who followed him. The instruction handed to the machine was narrow on purpose. Strip out Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Strip out Paul. Strip out every letter, every homily, every church father defending his own tradition. Then answer one question. What is left in the historical record about this man, written by people outside the faith? The model did not preach. It cross-referenced, and the first thing it flagged was not a miracle. It was a filing problem. 3 documents, 3 cities, 3 motives that have nothing in common except a name they all treat as a nuisance. Honestly, that is the part nobody prepares you for. You grow up hearing that the case for Jesus rests on faith alone, and that outside the Bible there is silence. There is not silence. There is paperwork. Now pay attention to this part, because the boundaries matter more than the drama. This investigation makes no ruling on divinity. No machine can. Grok has no parish, no career to protect, no seminary behind it, no bishop reading its output over breakfast. But it also has no authority over heaven. It reads text. It compares wording. It reports what a document can carry and what it cannot. Everything past that line belongs to you. So the question on the screen was historical, and it was flat. Did anyone outside the movement record this man, and what exactly did they say? The answer arrived as 3 names. The first is Tacitus, a Roman senator and historian, the hardest of the 3 to accuse of sympathy. His Annals, Book 15, Section 44, ties a group he calls Christians to a figure he calls Christus, and places that execution under the governor Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus is not building a case for the faith. He is explaining a public scandal, and he despises the people at the center of it. The second is Josephus, a Jewish historian who survived a war and wrote for Roman readers. His Antiquities of the Jews contains a passage about a man named James, identified as the brother of Jesus who is called Christ. It also contains a longer passage about Jesus himself, and that one is the most argued over paragraph in the field. Somebody, centuries after Josephus died, appears to have improved it. The third is Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor with an administrative headache. He wrote to the Emperor Trajan asking how to handle people in Bithynia and Pontus who gathered before dawn and sang to Christ as to a god. He was not curious about theology. He wanted procedure. A historian who hated them. A Jewish writer who was not one of them. A governor asking permission to punish them. 3 witnesses. Hold that number, because it is the spine of everything that follows. And here is the catch that makes the file worth opening. Not one of these men was trying to help. That is exactly what gives their words weight. A friendly source tells you what a community wanted preserved, while a hostile source tells you what it could not deny. Which brings us to a room in a provincial courthouse, and the reason this stopped being an academic exercise. Around the year 112, in a province on the southern shore of the Black Sea, people were dragged in front of Pliny on the word of anonymous accusers. Names on a list, handed up without a face attached. The governor asked each one a question, and then asked it twice more. Some denied it. Some said they had left the movement years before. 3 years, some of them, others longer. The ones who kept saying yes were led out for punishment, and Pliny wrote all of it down in the tone of a man reconciling accounts. You can hear the room in his letter, the repeated question, the pause, the shuffle of the next person forward, the smell of the incense they were told to burn to prove their loyalty. Everyone knows that pause. The moment you are asked to say the safe thing instead of the true one. Those people had no political power, no protection, no cathedral behind them, and their fear ended up preserving one of the most valuable descriptions we have of what the earliest Christians actually did. What Pliny wrote about their meetings comes later tonight, and it is stranger than the punishment. Let that sit for a second. The record of Jesus outside the Bible survives mostly because outsiders found his followers inconvenient. Rome kept files on problems. Problems get dated, named, and archived. There is a second thread running under all of this, and the machine kept returning to it. What the outsiders wrote and what the institutions later said the outsiders wrote are not always the same thing. One of these 3 passages was edited. Another has been quoted for centuries with more confidence than its wording supports. The hostile record and the inherited account do not perfectly overlap, and the gap between them is the story. Actually, the gap is the whole reason to run a machine at this. A human scholar knows the argument. A human scholar also knows who signs the paycheck. So the file was opened in order. Rome first, because Rome wrote first about the consequences. And Rome did not begin with Jesus. Rome began with a fire. In the summer of the year 64, flames took most of the capital, and a population that had lost its homes started looking for someone to blame. What happened next put the name Christus into an imperial history book for the first time, not as a teacher, not as a prophet, but as the origin of a group being fed to the crowd. The sentence Tacitus wrote about that execution is 1 line long. Read it wrong, and it proves nothing at all. The fire that made Rome write about Christus. The year was 64. Rome smelled of wet ash, scorched timber, and the river mud where people carried buckets through the night. Nero ruled the empire, and the fire had left whole streets blackened. Tacitus recorded what happened after the flames, when suspicion needed a target. He did not write at the scene. Tacitus wrote the Annals in the early 2nd century, decades after the fire and decades after the execution he described. His account belongs to a later historian looking back through Roman memory, official reports, and the political record surrounding Nero. That distance matters. But distance is not silence. The machine placed 5 names in sequence: Nero, the Christians, Christus, Pontius Pilate, Tiberius. That chain is the passage. Grok did not treat those names as a single proof. It separated them, checked their order, and marked the limits around each one. Nero supplies the political setting. Christians supply the accused group. Christus supplies the name behind the movement. Pontius Pilate supplies the execution authority. Tiberius supplies the imperial date. 1 sentence, 5 anchors. The question was never whether Tacitus witnessed Jesus in Jerusalem. He did not. The question was narrower. What did a Roman historian hostile to Christianity believe the Roman record preserved about its founder? And why did that historian connect the name Christus to an execution carried out under Pontius Pilate? The answer begins with Tacitus himself. Publius Cornelius Tacitus belonged to Rome's governing class. He served as a senator, held high office, and wrote about the emperors with the cold attention of someone who understood power from inside the room. His histories do not read like letters from a frightened convert. They read like an indictment of rulers who turned public disaster into private control. That makes the fire important. Nero needed the Roman population to stop looking toward the imperial household. Tacitus says the Christians became the chosen target. The accusation did not arise from a theological debate. It arose after a disaster, when a ruler needed blame to travel faster than smoke. The account says Nero fastened the suspicion on people hated for their shameful acts. Then he punished them with elaborate cruelty. Some were covered in animal skins and torn by dogs. Others were fixed to crosses. Some were burned as lamps when daylight failed. The details are brutal. Tacitus does not describe this punishment with admiration. He uses it to expose Nero's cruelty and the public's appetite for spectacle. Yet his contempt for Christians does not erase the historical information inside the passage. It gives the information an unusual shape. Rome did not preserve a sermon about Jesus. Rome preserved the punishment of his followers. The Annals calls Christianity a destructive superstition. That phrase belongs to Tacitus's judgment. It does not belong to the Christians themselves, and it does not describe the whole movement. It tells you how an elite Roman historian wanted his readers to view them. Here is what nobody tells you. A hostile label can still preserve a historical link. When Tacitus names Christus, he does not present a myth floating outside time. He places the name inside Tiberius's reign and under Pontius Pilate's authority. The movement has a founder. The founder has an execution. The execution belongs to a Roman governor. That is what the passage supports. It does not support everything people want it to support. Tacitus does not give a birthplace. He does not list teachings. He does not describe Galilee, the temple, the disciples, or the empty tomb. He does not claim that he interviewed a witness from Passover in Jerusalem. He does not confirm a resurrection. The text has a boundary. The boundary protects the evidence. Tacitus gives you an external attestation to a movement named after Christus and a tradition linking that figure's execution to Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. He does not give you a complete life of Jesus. He does not give you a Roman gospel. He gives you one hostile historical notice. That may sound small. It is small. Small evidence can still be solid evidence. The mistake comes when a narrow passage gets forced to answer a question it was never written to answer. Tacitus cannot settle every question about Jesus. He can place a movement, a name, and an execution tradition into the Roman record. That is already more than silence. The wording reached the present through manuscript transmission. No original copy of Tacitus's Annals survives from his own desk. The text passed through centuries of copying, storage, damage, and selection. Ink dried, pages disappeared. Scribes reproduced what they could read. Every surviving line has a history. This does not mean the passage is worthless. It means the passage must be handled like evidence from any ancient author. The date of composition matters. The manuscript tradition matters. The wording matters. The author's purpose matters. A document can be genuine and still limited. A witness can be hostile and still accurate about one detail. A later historian can preserve an older report without having stood beside the event. The room grows quieter at that point because the machine has removed the easy answers. It cannot say that Tacitus proves every Christian claim. It cannot say that Tacitus proves nothing. The result sits between those extremes, where serious history usually lives. Actually, that middle ground is what makes the passage difficult for institutions and skeptics alike. Institutions may want a hostile Roman sentence to carry more theological weight than it can bear. Skeptics may want the distance between Tacitus and Jesus to erase the sentence altogether. Neither move respects the document. The machine flagged another distinction. Tacitus wrote about Christians after the fire, but his purpose was not to investigate Jesus' life. His subject was Nero's response to the disaster. Christians entered the story because Nero used them as an answer to a political crisis. The subject is Rome. The historical consequence is Jesus. That difference matters to you because inherited Christian accounts often begin with meaning, while hostile Roman accounts begin with punishment. One tradition asks what Jesus revealed. Tacitus asks what Rome did to the people who carried his name. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account. There is the through line. Read the passage slowly. The words do not ask you to abandon faith, and they do not permit certainty where the document offers none. They show something more restrained. A Roman historian, writing after the event, knew a movement called Christian and traced its name back to Christus, executed under Pontius Pilate. That claim has a date, it has an author, it has a limit. The date is not the year 30. The date is the reign of Tiberius, preserved inside Tacitus's account. The author is not a disciple. The author is Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century. The limit is that he reports an established tradition without offering an eyewitness biography. 3 boundaries. Keep them. And get this, the expression, "the enemies kept the best records," is not a quotation from Tacitus. It is the investigator's synthesis. Tacitus did not praise the Christians. He did not defend them. He did not set out to preserve their faith. Yet his hostility forced him to record the connection between Christus, Pilate, and the movement Nero punished. The phrase belongs to the analysis. The evidence belongs to Tacitus. That distinction may sound technical, but it prevents the story from becoming propaganda. The goal is not to turn a Roman insult into a Christian confession. The goal is to see what survives when the writer has no reason to help. The fire burned in 64. Tacitus wrote decades later. Between those moments, the movement spread beyond Jerusalem, crossed provincial boundaries, and reached Roman attention. His passage assumes the name already carried a history. Where did that history come from? The Roman sentence does not explain it. That is why the first report cannot be the final report. Tacitus gives you the punishment, but not the internal memory behind the people being punished. He tells you how Rome saw Christians, but not how a Jewish historian described the world that produced them. The ash settles there. A different archive waits beyond Rome, written by a man who knew the Jewish conflict, understood Roman power, and had his own reason to shape the record. His evidence does not begin with Nero's fire. It begins with Jerusalem, a condemned man, and a name connected to Jesus. Tacitus preserved the Roman accusation, but the Jewish account carried a different kind of danger. The Jewish historian who named the brother. Rome gave you a hostile sentence. Jerusalem gives you a legal death. The setting changes from imperial punishment to provincial power, from Nero's blame after a fire to a Jewish historian watching officials change hands. Josephus was born Joseph ben Matthias in Jerusalem. He belonged to a priestly family, studied several Jewish traditions, and entered the violent years that ended with the destruction of the temple. During the revolt against Rome, his position changed. He survived, moved into the Roman orbit, and wrote under the protection of the Flavian emperors. That background matters. Josephus was not sitting inside a Christian congregation. He was not collecting testimony for the church. He was writing about the Jewish people, their laws, their leaders, their revolts, and the Roman forces that crushed them. His audience included Rome. The smell of Jerusalem in those years was dust, sweat, lamp smoke, and fear. Soldiers controlled roads outside the city. Priests argued over authority inside it. A governor could leave office, and the legal balance could shift before the next official arrived. That is the world Josephus placed on parchment. Around the years 93 or 94, he completed Antiquities of the Jews. The work stretched across 20 books and traced Jewish history from creation through the 1st century. It was not a Christian history. It was a Jewish historical work written for readers living under Roman power. The machine separated Josephus from the Christian text before comparing the names. That distinction closed one door and opened another. Josephus could not be treated as a Christian witness, but his account could still preserve information about the movement surrounding Jesus. The passage appears near the end of Antiquities, in Book 20, Chapter 9. It begins with a change in government. Porcius Festus had died. Lucius Albinus had not yet arrived in Judea. That interval created a dangerous space around Jerusalem. The outgoing governor was gone. The incoming governor had not taken control. In that gap, local authority moved faster than Roman review. Josephus says the high priest Ananus gathered the Sanhedrin. He brought before them a man named James, along with others, and accused them of breaking the law. The surviving account says Ananus condemned them to be stoned. The sentence came during a transition, not during a stable reign, not after a public trial described by Rome. During the interval between Festus and Albinus. That detail gives the passage its physical weight. A city gate closes, a messenger rides toward the coast, a new governor waits to receive the seal of office. Inside Jerusalem, a high priest acts before the next Roman authority can intervene. Then the name appears. Josephus identifies James as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That is the phrase historians cannot ignore. James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. The wording does not preach, it identifies. Josephus does not call Jesus Lord. He does not describe a miracle. He does not explain the resurrection. He uses the name as a reference point, almost as though his Roman readers already needed help distinguishing which Jesus he meant. That simple phrase carries more historical force than a grand confession would have carried in this setting. A confession would show belief. A reference can show common identification. Here is what most people do not realize. Josephus was not writing about Jesus in isolation. He was explaining why James mattered inside a political and legal crisis. The brother's name anchors the man. The brother's death anchors the movement. And the governor's absence anchors the date. Modern scholars treat the James passage as authentic or substantially authentic, though they continue to debate its details and implications. The exact legal process remains part of the discussion. The precise meaning of Josephus's wording also receives close attention. But the main reference has endured. The text exists. The shelf mark is public. The evidence does not depend on a sermon. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account becomes more complicated here. Tacitus viewed Christians from Rome after the fire and the punishment. Josephus viewed Jerusalem through the politics of Jewish law and Roman administration. Their documents do not repeat one another. They meet at the edge of a movement. That is why the names matter. Tacitus gives Christus and Pilate. Josephus gives James and Jesus. Pliny will give a governor and a procedure. 3 documents, 3 settings, 3 distances from the original events. No single passage carries the entire case. Together they form a pattern. Look at the date again. Josephus completed Antiquities around 93 or 94. James died before Albinus assumed office, after Festus died. Jesus belonged to an earlier generation, around the time of Tiberius and Pontius Pilate. The documents do not collapse into one moment. They form a chain across decades. A Roman historian writes after Nero's fire. A Jewish historian writes after Jerusalem's destruction. A provincial governor writes under Trajan. Each encounters a movement that began with Jesus and continued after his death. That is not a Christian claim inserted into one document. It is the shape created by different documents. But do not move too fast. Josephus's passage about James does not make Josephus a Christian. It does not confirm Jesus's divine nature. It does not independently establish every saying attributed to Jesus. It does not prove a resurrection. The text gives you a relationship and a public identifier. James was known as the brother of Jesus who was called Christ. That is all the sentence promises. That is enough to matter. The words also reveal how ancient writers used names. Jesus was a common name in first-century Judea. Josephus had to identify which Jesus he meant. The phrase, called Christ, functions as a distinguishing label. It does not require Josephus to accept the title as true. A Roman administrator might record the accused. A Jewish historian might write, the brother of Jesus called Christ. A Christian reader might hear a confession inside the same words. The document must be allowed to speak before interpretation begins. That is where the machine slowed the comparison. Grok flagged the difference between a document's wording and a later reader's conclusion. It marked what Josephus says. It did not turn Josephus into a believer. It also did not erase the sentence, because the sentence fails to answer theological questions. The result stayed narrow. Actually, narrow evidence is often the evidence you can trust longest. A text that gives one name, one relationship, and one legal setting may outlast a later account that claims to explain everything. The James passage carries grief without describing grief. Josephus gives no speech from the condemned man, no final prayer, no crowd's cry, only an accusation, a judgment, a death, and a change in Roman administration. The silence has texture. A stone strikes the ground. Dust gathers at the edge of a robe. Somewhere beyond the city, Albinus is traveling toward the province that will inherit the decision. Then Albinus arrived. Josephus says the new governor disapproved of what Ananus had done. Ananus was removed from the high priesthood after pressure from those who regarded his action as unlawful. The account therefore preserves more than James's name. It preserves a conflict over who possessed the right to execute judgment. That conflict matters because the passage does not float in religious legend. It sits inside the machinery of office, accusation, succession, and punishment. The legal transition is documented. The official names are documented. The brother is named. This does not mean every detail has become certain. It means the evidence belongs to a real historical setting that Josephus understood from inside the politics of Judea. The inherited account tells you what James meant to the early movement. Josephus tells you how James appeared within a public crisis. Those perspectives can disagree about meaning while still meeting on identity. That is the important distinction. One source carries faith from within. One source carries notice from outside. The machine's task is not to force them into agreement. It is to identify where they overlap and where the documents stop. The through line remains the hostile record versus the inherited Christian account. Tacitus recorded the punishment of Christians. Josephus recorded the death of James. Neither writer became a Christian witness by mentioning the movement. That is why the James reference is stronger when kept modest. If the passage claimed too much, it would invite suspicion. Instead, it does something smaller. It assumes Jesus is a known figure and identifies James through him. A brother becomes a historical pointer. The pointer leads toward a second passage in Josephus, one that appears in Antiquities, Book 18, and has carried far more theological weight than the James reference. It is called the Testimonium Flavianum. The name sounds clean. The transmission history is not. For centuries, readers treated that passage as a direct Jewish statement about Jesus. But the text reached you through Christian manuscript transmission, and the question is no longer whether Josephus mentions Jesus. The question is what Josephus originally wrote before later hands carried the passage across the centuries. Did Josephus write the sentence as it now stands? Or does the surviving paragraph contain more than one voice? That question cannot be answered by volume, tradition, or confidence. It requires the wording itself. And the next file begins where the ink stops belonging to one hand. The sentence that could not survive unchanged. The Roman record linked Christians to Christus and Pontius Pilate. Josephus linked James to Jesus, called Christ. But nobody can explain why the most famous Josephus passage carries a voice that may not belong to one author. The question is no longer whether Josephus mentioned Jesus. What did the Jewish historian write before later Christian hands carried his sentence across the centuries? The Testimonium Flavianum appears in Antiquities, Book 18. It stands inside Josephus's account of the Jewish world under Roman rule. The passage concerns Jesus, his reputation, his followers, and the consequences surrounding his death. That much is clear. The The problem begins when the wording is examined. Some statements fit the role of Josephus as a Jewish historian writing for Roman readers. Other descriptions sound like a Christian confession. The passage speaks of Jesus as the Christ and describes extraordinary deeds connected with him. Those elements do not sit together without friction. The ink carries the conflict. A copyist takes a pen. The parchment presses against the desk. A lamp burns low beside the text. One word is copied, another is adjusted, and a sentence crosses a border between historical notice and religious proclamation. That border is where the argument lives. Grok separated the passage into claims instead of accepting the paragraph as one solid unit. It marked the references to Jesus. It marked the language surrounding his reputation. It marked the statements that sound less like Josephus and more like a later Christian reader. The machine did not recover a missing original. It identified the damage. Most modern scholars judge that the passage was edited in transmission. Some argue that an authentic core about Jesus remains beneath the Christian wording. Others disagree about how much of that core can be restored and which parts belong to Josephus himself. The disagreement is real. The certainty is not. That does not make the passage useless. It means the Testimonium must be handled with more care than the James reference. The James passage stands apart from it. James is identified as the brother of Jesus called Christ within a legal account of Jerusalem.
The Testimonium is a separate paragraph with a more troubled history. 2 passages, 2 levels of confidence. The difference matters because one damaged paragraph cannot erase a less openly Christian reference elsewhere in the same work. Josephus does not need to become a believer for his account of James to matter. He does not need to praise Jesus for the identification to carry historical weight. Actually, this is where inherited certainty becomes expensive. A congregation may hear one polished sentence and assume the sentence traveled unchanged from Josephus to the modern page. The manuscript record does not give that comfort. The record gives a question. In Antiquities, Book 20, Josephus tells the story of James. Festus had died. Albinus had not yet reached Judea. Ananus held the office of high priest and used the interval to act against James and others. A legal gap became a human catastrophe. James stood before the Sanhedrin while Roman authorities shifted outside the city. The outgoing governor was gone. The next governor had not arrived. A decision made in that narrow interval could become permanent before a Roman official examined it. Josephus says Ananus condemned James to be stoned. The scene needs no added drama. A man is accused. The court convenes. The sentence falls. A community loses a leader while the province waits for its next administrator. The tragedy was not only James' death. It was the silence around it. No speech from James survives in Josephus. No defense, no final appeal. Only the action of Ananus and the political timing that made the action possible. Everyone who has watched a powerful office move faster than justice knows that fear. A name disappears into procedure. The person remains, but the file remembers the authority that condemned him. Josephus then records the consequence.
Albinus arrived and objected to what Ananus had done. Pressure followed. Ananus lost the high priesthood. The new governor had not witnessed James's death. He inherited the decision after the stones had fallen. That is what makes the episode human. The Roman and Jewish records do not give you the same picture. Tacitus gives punishment under Nero. Josephus gives a death during a change in provincial authority. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account meets here, not in agreement over meaning, but in contact with names, offices, and loss. The date on the administration matters. The death of Festus created the opening. The arrival of Albinus closed it. Between those two events, Ananus acted against James. Josephus placed the tragedy inside the machinery of Roman Judea. That machinery did not care about later debates over doctrine. It cared who held power. The James reference therefore carries a narrow claim. Josephus knew of Jesus as a figure used to identify James, and he recorded James's death during a documented transition between Roman governors. He did not confirm Christian claims about Jesus' nature. That limit protects the passage. It also makes the contrast with the Testimonium sharper. The James reference does not need religious language to matter. The Testimonium contains language that requires a textual investigation before it can be used as evidence. One passage names the brother, the other raises suspicion. The ink tells two stories. Sit with that for a second. Read the James reference without adding a sermon around it. Then read the Testimonium without allowing centuries of confidence to decide its wording before the manuscript does. The machine's comparison exposed the gap between those acts. It found a source that could preserve real information about Jesus, while also showing how later transmission could reshape the same historical record. That is the first major finding. A text can survive and still change. A witness can remain useful and still carry an editorial scar. A passage can preserve an authentic core without allowing anyone to recover every original word. The harder question is, who benefited when Josephus's sentence reached readers in a more Christian form? The answer cannot be assigned to one anonymous scribe without evidence. The surviving tradition does not provide a signed confession from the person who altered the wording. The responsible conclusion is narrower. Christian transmission preserved Josephus, and the Testimonium passed through copies shaped by Christian readers and keepers. The hand is visible in the wording. The hand is not named. That distinction matters for an audience that checks names and dates.
Josephus completed Antiquities around 93 or 94. The work survived through later manuscripts, quotations, translations, and scholarly reconstruction. The original copy has not returned to the desk. No correction can be summoned from the first page. The passage must be tested through language, context, and comparison. Does the paragraph fit Josephus's usual approach? Does its description of Jesus match the purpose of the surrounding account? Do later witnesses preserve the same form? Those questions remain open because the original wording is not fully recoverable. The James passage gives a steadier point. It identifies James through Jesus. It places James inside a legal crisis. It preserves the names Festus, Albinus, and Ananus. The Testimonium gives a more damaged point. It contains a reference to Jesus, but its present form cannot be treated as untouched evidence. That is not an attack on faith. It is a fact about transmission. The truth does not need forged certainty. If you are the kind of person who wants to know what was hidden from you, this is the moment to stay with the record instead of the inherited summary. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next file moves from a historian's retrospective account to a governor's request for instructions. Now, back to what the machine found in the second archive. Pliny the Younger did not sit down to write a life of Jesus. He did not compose a history of Judea. He opened a legal problem in Bithynia and Pontus and sent it toward Emperor Trajan. That change of document changes the evidence. Josephus looked backward across Jewish history. Pliny wrote from inside administration. His letter carried a provincial question into the imperial office. The handwriting shifts. The temperature drops. The through line now moves from the hostile record versus the inherited Christian account to the Roman office that had to decide how Christians should be treated. The next witness does not offer a biography. He offers a file of accusations, interrogations, and an emperor's reply. And what Pliny reported before asking Rome for permission was stranger than the punishment. The governor who asked Rome what to do. The Roman file has moved from history into administration. Tacitus wrote about punishment after Nero's fire. Josephus recorded James during a change of governors. Pliny the Younger opened a letter because Christians had become a provincial problem. The place was Bithynia and Pontus. The time was around 112. Pliny served there under Emperor Trajan, far from Jerusalem and decades after Pontius Pilate. His office dealt with roads, taxes, lawsuits, public order, and complaints delivered by people who expected Rome to act. Then Christian names began arriving. Not through one formal petition, through accusations.
The governor had a question, and the question sounded practical. Who should be punished? What counted as evidence? Did the name Christian itself justify a sentence? Was Rome required to search for these people, or wait until someone brought them forward? Pliny had never handled such trials before. That admission matters. He was not an expert on Christian teaching. He did not possess a handbook from the apostles. He did not claim a private memory of Jesus. He had a room, a set of accusations, a procedure, and no settled policy to follow. Grok surfaced that uncertainty before it surfaced the religious details. The machine marked the governor's own confession. This was new territory for him. Pliny had not taken part in Christian trials before receiving the accusations. A Roman governor was asking for instructions. That is the document. The letter appears in Pliny's Epistles, Book 10, Letter 96. It was not written as a theological essay. Pliny wrote to Trajan because the cases troubled him, and because the penalties involved the authority of the emperor. He had received anonymous accusations. Some names came from lists. Some accused people had already disappeared from the movement. Others stood before Pliny and denied being Christians. The governor questioned them more than once, testing whether they would repeat their denial under pressure 3 times. That was the test. If they rejected the charge, called upon the Roman gods, and offered wine and incense before an image of the emperor, Pliny released them. The ritual was not designed to discover what they believed in private. It tested whether they would comply in public. A person could leave the room alive. The price was a gesture, a pinch of incense, a cup of wine. Words spoken before an image, a denial that might sound small to someone outside the room, but could feel like surrender to the person being questioned. This is where fear enters the record. The movement did not yet control a throne. It did not command an army. It did not possess a public institution that could shield its members from a provincial governor. A clerk wrote down names. A guard waited near the door. The accused chose whether to recant. The room had no sermon. It had a test. Pliny then described what he learned from those who admitted they had once belonged to the group. They said they met on a fixed day before dawn. They sang a hymn to Christ as to a god. They bound themselves by an oath not to commit theft, adultery, fraud, or breach of trust. The words came from a governor who wanted to know whether the movement threatened public order. Instead, his report preserved conduct. He did not write that they met to plan a rebellion. He did not record weapons, military ranks, or plans against Rome. He described a gathering, a song, and promises against crimes that Roman law already condemned. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account appears again. The inherited account explains why Christ was worshipped. Pliny records that Christ was worshipped. He does not explain the theology. That distinction is the point. The governor had no interest in proving Christian belief. He wanted to classify behavior. His letter gives you the practice, because practice was what Rome could question. What most people do not realize is how little a Roman official needed to know. Pliny did not need to understand the Gospel of John. He did not need to settle the meaning of the cross. He needed to decide whether a defendant would obey the order placed before them. So the machine read the letter as 2 separate records. The first record is administrative. Christians reached a Roman governor. Accusations were filed, and Pliny needed guidance. The second record is communal. Former members described a fixed meeting, a hymn to Christ, and an oath against wrongdoing. 1 document, 2 windows. The first window shows Roman contact. The second shows early worship. But why did Pliny describe their moral promises in such detail, if the real issue was whether they honored the emperor? The answer may lie in the way governors investigated unfamiliar groups. Rome often cared less about a person's private theology than about loyalty, public order, and obedience. Pliny's questions moved toward visible actions. Did the accused invoke the gods? Did they offer sacrifice? Would they reject the name that had brought them before the court? That procedure made the Christian identity physical. The accused spoke. The incense smoked. The wine touched the altar. The governor watched. And get this, People who had once belonged to the movement told Pliny they had stopped attending years earlier. Some had been away for 3 years, others for longer. Their testimony showed that the network reached across time, even when individual members claimed they had left it. Pliny did not take their word at face value. He tested it. He made them perform the ritual that Christians, by their own account, would not perform. Those who complied were dismissed. Those who refused faced punishment. The letter does not give the names of these people. Their names vanished. Their practices remained. That should stop you. The record is not a Christian manuscript preserving the courage of famous apostles. It is a provincial report preserving unnamed people under examination. Their identity comes through the conduct that placed them at risk. Before dawn, they gathered. Before a Roman image, they were tested.
Between those two moments, a life could change. The machine surfaced this contrast without turning anonymous people into invented heroes. No named reaction exists in Pliny's letter. No personal speech survives. The document gives only the procedure and the answers recorded by the governor. That is enough to feel the pressure. A person stands before an official. The charge is repeated. The governor offers a way out. The safe response waits on the tongue. Some accepted it, some did not. Pliny's letter never claims that every accusation was true. He mentions anonymous charges because they complicated his process. He wanted Trajan to tell him which accusations deserved action and which should be ignored. This was not a clean investigation. It was a frightened administration trying to create a rule. The smell of hot wax rises from the document's world. A seal closes the letter. The message travels toward Trajan, carrying a problem the provincial governor cannot solve alone. Pliny asks whether age should matter. He asks whether a person who recants should be pardoned. He asks whether the name itself is punishable, or only crimes connected to it. He does not ask whether Jesus rose from the dead. He does not ask whether God accepted the Christian hymn. He does not ask whether Christ was divine. The limit remains visible. Pliny was not an eyewitness to Jesus. He never met him. He never visited Jerusalem to investigate the execution under Pilate. He never claims to know whether Christian beliefs are true. What he knew came from an investigation around 112, roughly 80 years after the death tradition connected to Pilate. That distance does not erase his report. It defines it. Pliny proves Roman administrative contact with Christians. He preserves information about early Christian worship. He records a hymn directed to Christ as to a god. He reveals a group binding its members against theft, adultery, fraud, and betrayal. He does not prove the divine claim behind the worship. The document cannot carry that weight. A machine can compare it to Tacitus and Josephus. It can mark the dates, authors, locations, and motives. It can show that 3 writers encountered the movement from outside. But comparison is not revelation, and pattern detection is not a verdict from heaven. The result stays human. 3 documents now stand on the table. Tacitus writes from Rome about punishment after the fire. Josephus writes about James inside Jerusalem's political machinery. Pliny writes from Bithynia and Pontus, asking Trajan how to process accusations. 3 witnesses, 3 motives, 3 limits. The through line has not changed. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account produces no single polished narrative. It produces fragments that meet at crucial points. Jesus, Christus, James, Pilate, worship, and punishment. Now pay attention to the wording of Pliny's evidence. He does not report that Christians merely admired Christ. He reports that they sang to him as to a god. That phrase comes through a governor who treated their belief as a legal complication. The outsider recorded the practice. What did the emperor tell him to do with people who refused the ritual? That answer arrived in Trajan's reply. It did not transform Christianity into a protected religion. It did not end suspicion. It gave Pliny a limited policy, one that kept the movement exposed to accusation while restricting the way officials pursued it.
Christians were not to be hunted through an organized search, but a formal accusation could still bring punishment if the accused refused to recant. The distinction sounds narrow. For the people in the room, it was life or death.
Pliny's letter leaves Jesus outside the courthouse. His name enters through the people who carry it. The governor never reaches the Galilean teacher directly. He reaches a community that meets before dawn, sings to Christ as to a god, and refuses certain acts when Rome demands them. That is what this document can give you. No biography, no resurrection proof, no theological verdict. A dated administrative encounter with a movement that still carried the name of Jesus. The governor asked Rome what to do, but the answer exposed something far larger than a provincial rule. Why the file is thin but real. 3 documents now sit beside one another. Tacitus wrote Roman history after Nero's fire. Josephus wrote Jewish antiquarian history after war and destruction. Pliny wrote provincial correspondence while asking Trajan how to handle accusations. They are not 3 copies of one story. They were produced for different purposes. The difference matters because the outside record does not fail by disappearing from one locked archive. It survives in fragments, filtered through attention, procedure, and transmission. Rome recorded what threatened order. Josephus recorded what mattered inside Jewish history. Pliny recorded what reached a governor's desk. The machine placed each document back inside its original room. Tacitus worked with imperial history, public blame, and the reputation of Nero. Josephus worked with Jewish law, Roman power, and the memory of Jerusalem. Pliny worked with names, accusations, rituals, and instructions from the emperor. A parchment does not speak outside its setting. That is where the file becomes thin, not empty, thin. The machine's analysis identified 3 reasons for the sparse external record. The reasons are not hidden codes. They are historical pressures visible in the documents. First, Roman administrative priorities.
The empire recorded taxes, military movements, legal disputes, governors, roads, and threats to public order. A small Jewish movement in the 1st century did not command the attention given to a war, a rebellion, or a succession crisis. Jesus could matter deeply to his followers and still receive little space in the files of Rome. Second, limited elite interest. Roman writers did not rush to preserve every provincial religious teacher. Josephus focused on Jewish history and the conflict with Rome. Tacitus focused on imperial conduct and the damage caused by Nero. Pliny focused on a legal question that had landed in his office. Their subjects narrowed their attention. Third, fear surrounding accusations of disloyalty. A Christian name could draw a person into interrogation. A public refusal could bring punishment. A governor might record a group only after accusations had spread far enough to require action.
People who feared Rome did not leave behind polished memoirs for future historians. They left traces, a name on a list, a sentence in a letter, a hostile line in a history. The 3 reasons explain why the record is short. They do not explain why the surviving lines still matter. For that, the wording must be placed under pressure. Look at the 3 documents again. Tacitus gives a movement named after Christus and connects its founder to Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Josephus identifies James through Jesus called Christ. Pliny records Roman contact with Christians and describes worship directed toward Christ. Each witness stands outside the Christian confession. Each witness arrives from a different road. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account does not produce identical language. It produces a common center surrounded by different motives.
That center becomes more useful because no one document controls the entire picture. But here's the catch. Agreement between outsiders does not mean every sentence deserves equal confidence. It means each line must be tested against its own context. The James reference is distinct from the Testimonium. Pliny's letter is distinct from Tacitus' history. A governor's administrative report does not carry the same kind of information as a senator's account of imperial punishment. The machine flagged the categories before weighing the claims: author, date, purpose, transmission. Limit. That order prevents the file from becoming a pile of impressive names. Josephus remains the hardest case. The Testimonium Flavianum appears in Antiquities, Book 18, but the surviving form carries language that has raised questions for centuries. The passage speaks about Jesus, his reputation, and his followers.
Some of its wording fits a Christian declaration more comfortably than a Jewish historian writing for Romans. The issue is not whether Christians preserved Josephus. They did. The issue is whether preservation left the wording unchanged. A comparison of the Testimonium with Josephus's surrounding style creates friction. A phrase can fit the subject and still fail the author's habits. A sentence can contain an old historical notice and a later confession pressed around it. That is why scholars argue over an authentic core. The original may have included a notice about Jesus. The exact shape of that notice cannot be recovered with complete certainty. The surviving paragraph has been transmitted through copies made in a Christian world, where readers had reasons to value the passage and reasons to make its meaning unmistakable. No signed confession survives. No copyist writes, "This sentence was changed here." The evidence comes through comparison. That is the work Grok performed. It did not invent an original manuscript. It did not claim to see ink that no human has seen. It compared the passage's wording, context, and transmission history, then marked where certainty ends. The text exists. The original wording is damaged. Both statements can stand together. This is the point where a damaged witness becomes a human injustice. A copyist sits with a page before him. The room smells of lamp oil and scraped parchment. He knows the readers who will receive the text, and he knows the beliefs they bring to it. A phrase that sounds uncertain can be sharpened with one insertion. A historical notice can be made to sound like a confession. The page remains, but the voice changes. The person who wrote the first version cannot answer. That is the wound. For centuries, readers may treat the altered wording as direct evidence from Josephus. They may build confidence on a sentence he may not have written in its present form. The correction arrives much later through textual criticism, after the original author is gone and the copyist has vanished. No apology reaches the page. The James reference gives you a contrast. It identifies Jesus without requiring Josephus to confess faith. It places James inside a documented transition between Festus and Albinus. Its rhetorical situation does not demand a Christian declaration. Pliny's letter offers the same kind of restraint. He writes because Christians create a legal problem. His purpose is administrative. His description of their practices does not depend on a sermon written for believers. These passages matter because their situations do not require a Christian confession. The Testimonium is different. Its present wording asks for a higher level of suspicion. That does not make the whole passage false. It makes the whole passage indivisible. The machine separated the possible historical core from the phrases that carry a later theological sound. Modern scholars continue to debate how much remains and how it should be reconstructed. There is no honest shortcut. The manuscript cannot be forced to reveal a sentence it no longer preserves. The file grows stronger when uncertainty is marked instead of buried. Tacitus remains a hostile Roman notice. Josephus remains a Jewish historian with a stable James reference and a disputed Jesus passage. Pliny remains a provincial governor, describing Christians while requesting instructions. 3 authors, 3 purposes. 3 different kinds of evidence. The number has become a weight. 3 does not mean certainty about every Christian claim. 3 means the movement cannot be reduced to one later devotional account. The outsiders noticed it in Rome, Jerusalem, and Bithynia and Pontus. That spread matters. A single rumor can travel. 3 documents with different purposes create a harder problem for anyone who wants to call the entire record invention. Still, the machine refused the easy victory. It did not label every hostile mention independent in the same way. Tacitus may have relied on Roman information available in his period. Josephus wrote after the events. Pliny investigated Christians in his own province but never met Jesus. The evidence has distance. The distance is visible. The distance also makes the wording more valuable. These writers did not repeat a shared Christian script. They preserved separate encounters with a movement that had already developed beyond its first generation. The inherited Christian account tells you what the movement believed about Jesus. The external dossier shows when outsiders began dealing with people who carried his name. Those are different questions. The machine kept them apart.
And get this, the most damaging problem in the file is not that an outside writer hated Christianity. It is that a later hand may have made an outside writer sound Christian. That alteration can distort the record without destroying it. The James reference remains separate. Pliny's letter remains separate. Tacitus remains separate. One damaged paragraph cannot erase every external witness. The text has scars. The archive still speaks. If hostile witnesses preserve the movement, what does their wording reveal when read together? That is the midpoint question. Not what later sermons wanted the documents to say. Not what a modern argument needs them to say. What did Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny actually preserve when their words are placed beside their dates, locations, and purposes? The answer will not arrive through one grand declaration. It will emerge from a Roman report that treats a name as an execution record. The next file carries a date.
It carries a governor's memory.
It carries the punishment of a movement that Rome had already learned to fear. Tacitus gave you the aftermath of fire. Josephus gave you the death of James. And Pliny gave you the pressure of a provincial office. The wording is fragmented. The transmission is damaged, and the hostile record still holds. But the next document turns that name into an execution record. The Roman line that survived the fire. The file returns to Rome, to the summer of 64, and to the passage that binds Christus to Pontius Pilate. Tacitus wrote about Nero's response after the flames tore through the Capitol. His account survived through medieval manuscript transmission, copied by hands far removed from the streets where the fire burned. The parchment carries a Roman memory. It also carries a problem. Tacitus wrote the Annals in the early 2nd century. The fire came decades before his composition.
The execution of Jesus came earlier still, during the reign of Tiberius.
Tacitus was not present at Golgotha. He was not standing in Pilate's courtyard. He did not interview a disciple. He wrote after the movement had acquired a name. The machine placed the dates beside one another. Tiberius ruled Rome from 14 to 37. Pontius Pilate governed Judea during part of that reign. The fire came in 64. Tacitus wrote the Annals later, in a Rome that remembered Nero through fear, scandal, and political damage. The distance is real. So is the attestation. Grok returned to Annals, Book 15, Section 44, and separated Tacitus's account into its historical chain. Nero blamed the Christians. The Christians carried the name of Christus. Christus suffered execution. Pontius Pilate held authority in Judea. Tiberius supplied the imperial date. 5 links. 1 Roman passage. The context matters more than the famous sentence. Tacitus is explaining how Nero responded to the fire. He says the emperor shifted suspicion toward a group already hated for what he calls its shameful practices. Then the punishments began. Tacitus describes Christians as a destructive superstition. The phrase reveals his contempt. It also shows that the movement had become visible enough to receive a category inside elite Roman history. Rome did not preserve a life of Jesus. Rome preserved the public punishment of people who carried his name. That difference gives the passage its force. The manuscript tradition does not hand over a clean sheet from Tacitus's own desk. The original Annals are gone. Later copies preserve the work through layers of transmission. A scribe copies an earlier page. Another reader handles the next copy. Centuries leave dust in the margins, damp in the bindings, and gaps between what Tacitus wrote and what survives. The passage still has an author. It still has a location inside the Annals. It still has a historical setting. The damage does not make every line disappear. Now, pay attention to this part. The relevant sentence comes from a hostile Roman writer, but hostility does not equal accuracy about everything. Tacitus may have repeated information available in Roman circles. He may have relied on records or reports that no longer survive. The passage gives no path back to every source behind his wording. That is the limit. It is also the reason to quote the line with care. Tacitus has just described Nero's effort to blame Christians for the fire. Then he identifies the origin of their name. In a standard translation from the Latin, the passage reads, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. The sentence is short. The consequences are not. Tacitus does not describe Christus as a legend. He does not place him outside Roman time. He connects the name to a person who suffered the extreme penalty during Tiberius's reign, under Pontius Pilate. That is what the sentence says. It does not say that Tacitus believed Jesus was divine. It does not confirm that the resurrection occurred. It does not verify every saying in the Gospels. It does not provide a biography. The sentence draws one narrow line through history: Christus, Tiberius, Pilate. Execution. The language is Roman, not Christian. Extreme penalty points toward crucifixion without turning the sentence into a devotional account. One of our procurators places Pilate inside the Roman administrative world. Tacitus is not interested in the meaning Christians gave the death. He is interested in what Rome did. The through line sharpens here: the hostile record versus the inherited Christian account. The inherited account begins with the significance of the cross. Tacitus begins with its political usefulness. His passage records the execution as the origin point of a hated movement. A Roman historian condemned the superstition. He still preserved its founder. The enemies kept the best records. One sentence, 6 words after the pause. The line is not a quotation from Tacitus. It is the investigator's synthesis of the pattern across Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny. The enemies did not preserve the best records because they understood Jesus better. They preserved records because they had no interest in protecting the Christian story. They wrote when Christians became a problem. They wrote when officials needed an explanation. They wrote when a legal question reached a governor's desk. That is the paradox. A friendly account may preserve memory with warmth. A hostile account may preserve the same movement through accusation. The warmth can be dismissed as devotion. The accusation can be tested against dates, offices, and political motives. Tacitus gives you no safe comfort. He does not say, this movement is true. He says, in effect, that Rome knew its name, knew the tradition of its founder's execution, and knew where that execution belonged in imperial history. That is the narrow claim. Keep it narrow. The machine did not enlarge the passage, it reduced it. It removed conclusions that the text could not support and kept the details that remained. Grok marked Tacitus as external evidence for a historical movement and its connection to Christus and Pilate. The result was colder than a sermon. It was stronger than silence. The fire itself has a disputed history and popular retelling, but Tacitus's literary setting is clear. Nero needed blame after catastrophe. Christians became the target. Tacitus used the episode to display imperial cruelty and his own contempt for the movement. He did not write as a neutral observer. Neutrality is not required for every fact. A prosecutor may hate the accused and still record the date of an arrest. A governor may fear disorder and still preserve the words of a defendant. A historian may despise a group and still identify its founder. The document must be tested claim by claim. That should stop you. Tacitus cannot carry the whole Christian case. He can carry one historical beam. The movement named Christian existed by his period. Its name was linked to Christus. Roman memory connected Christus with an execution under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. The beam holds that weight. no more. The date of composition creates distance. The fire came in 64. Tacitus wrote later. The execution occurred decades before the fire, during Tiberius's rule.
A historian writing after the fact cannot become an eyewitness through confidence of tone. The elegant sentence still has a gap behind it. That gap is not a weakness to hide. It is part of the evidence. History does not erase distance because a conclusion feels important. It records distance, then asks what survives across it. The Roman record survived across fire, regime change, and copying. The original desk is gone. The name remains. There is an ancient to today bridge here, but it must be built with restraint. Tacitus describes a mechanism familiar to every age, a public disaster, a group marked as dangerous, and an institution directing blame toward people with little power to answer. That mechanism can appear wherever authority needs a target. The comparison does not claim that modern events repeat Nero's Rome. It does not name a living leader. It does not predict what comes next. It asks a smaller question. When a powerful institution labels a vulnerable group, who gets to preserve the record? The condemned movement has one disadvantage. Its enemies often control the archive. Look at the physical process. A decree is spoken. A clerk scratches the names into wax. A governor seals a letter. A historian chooses which punishment belongs in the imperial narrative. The people being described may leave no document of their own, yet their names pass through the hands of those who oppose them, erased from the celebration, erased from the protection, preserved in the accusation. The machines surfaced the pattern without treating it as a secret code. Tacitus did not hide a message for modern readers. Josephus did not create a Christian defense. Pliny did not plan to preserve a worship record. Their motives were narrower. Their consequences were larger. Pliny's letter now fits beside Tacitus's line.
Pliny never met Jesus, but he recorded Christians singing to Christ as to a god. Tacitus never met Jesus, but he linked Christus to Pilate under Tiberius. Josephus never became a Christian witness, but he identified James through Jesus called Christ. 3 outsiders, 3 forms of contact, 3 limits. The next question is not whether outsiders noticed Christians. They did. The next question is who benefited when their records were interpreted by later institutions. That question leads away from the fire and toward the human ledger, the people who copied, classified, taught, and sometimes corrected the record long after the original witnesses were gone. The Roman line survived the flames, but the hands that carried it forward had their own interests. The people who decided which witness reached you. Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny left 3 different records. Yet no ancient text reaches you untouched by hands, institutions, and choices.
A historian writes a line. A scribe copies it. A bishop cites it. A council draws a boundary around it. Then generations inherit the result. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account did not end when Tacitus put down his pen. It continued through libraries, monasteries, translation desks, and pulpits that decided which words would be heard. That is the human ledger. Constantine appears near the start of many popular Bible stories. His name often supports the claim that the Council of Nicaea chose the New Testament books in 325. That claim is false. The Council of Nicaea addressed creed and doctrine. It produced the Nicene Creed during disputes about Christ's nature. It did not vote to create the New Testament canon. No surviving record shows bishops placing the 4 Gospels and Paul's letters on a table, then voting them into Scripture. The myth feels neat. History is not neat. Constantine ruled an empire, moving from persecution toward official favor. That shift changed the world around Christian texts. A faith once investigated through accusations in Bithynia
now entered imperial debates about unity, doctrine, and authority. The pressure changed shape. Before Constantine, Pliny asked Trajan how to punish Christians. After Constantine, bishops argued over Christian belief across an empire. A movement Rome once treated as a legal nuisance had become large enough to trouble emperors. That reversal has a date, but it did not happen in one council room. The canon grew through use, argument, copying, rejection, and local lists. Later institutions treated the process as settled. The surviving record shows decisions unfolding across generations. Athanasius of Alexandria provides one dated landmark. In 367, Athanasius sent his 39th festal letter to churches under his authority. The letter listed the 27 books now recognized as the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the letters, and Revelation. But Athanasius did more than list books. He warned against writings called apocryphal. One bishop in Alexandria did not invent every Christian text, yet his letter shows an authority drawing a sharper line between books permitted for public reading and books placed outside the boundary. 367. 27 books. That letter did not change Tacitus' sentence. It changed the setting in which readers encountered every sentence about Christianity. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account entered a second stage. Outsiders had written about suspects, victims, and legal problems. Later institutions shaped the Christian account through accepted books, authorized readings, and inherited boundaries. The two records entered the same libraries. They did not receive equal treatment.
Jerome offers another case. Born around 347, he translated biblical texts into Latin in work that became the Vulgate. His choices influenced Western Christianity for centuries. A word chosen in translation could enter liturgy, art, and ordinary belief. Translation creates power. But a translation choice does not prove a plan to suppress truth. Jerome faced difficult languages, varied manuscripts, and inherited readings. His decisions shaped later interpretation, yet not every disputed phrase proves deliberate concealment. That line must hold. A person can influence the record without plotting against it. A text can change without a council ordering the change. A tradition can harden before anyone notices. Look at the mechanism. An early copy has one wording. A later copy receives a gloss. A translation makes one meaning sound certain. A preacher repeats it. A generation hears the repetition as the original text. The record narrows. The listener loses options. This is why Josephus matters. The Testimonium Flavianum did not arrive from a sealed Roman archive. It passed through a Christian world where scribes preserved Josephus because Josephus mentioned Jesus. Preservation saved the passage. Transmission complicated it. The two facts cannot be separated. A Christian copyist did not need to destroy Josephus to change how Josephus sounded. One phrase could make a historical notice resemble a confession. The work survived. The original voice became harder to identify. That is the danger of a damaged witness. No one needs to accuse every copyist of bad faith. No one needs to claim that every monastery hid a scheme. The documentary fact is simpler. Later transmission can preserve a text and alter it at the same time. That is why textual criticism exists. Paper does not confess. Ink does not explain itself. Scholars compare copies, quotations, translations, vocabulary, and context. They ask which reading best explains the others. They notice when a paragraph begins to speak in a voice from a later community. The work takes time. The consequences last. In 1546, the Council of Trent formally defined the Roman Catholic canon in response to the Reformation. That decision came more than 11 centuries after Athanasius' letter. The dates show that the boundaries around Scripture were not created by one vote at Nicaea. Dates break myths. 325, Nicaea and the Creed. 367, Athanasius and 27 New Testament books. 1546, Trent and the Roman Catholic canon. 3 separate moments, 1 inherited bookshelf. Now, pay attention to what this does not mean. It does not mean a council invented Jesus. Tacitus wrote about Christus and Pilate before Nicaea.
Josephus wrote about James before Athanasius. Pliny wrote about Christians singing to Christ before Jerome opened his translation desk. The outside evidence predates the later boundaries. That is why the 3 documents matter. Athanasius could classify books. Jerome could shape Latin readings. Trent could define a canon. None of them could send Tacitus back to erase Pontius Pilate. None could remove Pliny's provincial letter from Roman correspondence. The hostile record remained outside their control. That is a hard fact. Grok then placed this evidence before 3 other systems. ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini received the same narrow question. Do Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny independently support limited claims about Jesus, Pilate, Christians, and early worship? The comparison did not ask them to rule on God. It asked them to sort documents. The systems converged on the same restrained center. Tacitus links Christus to execution under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Josephus identifies James through Jesus called Christ, while the Testimonium remains disputed. Pliny records Roman action against Christians and their worship of Christ. 4 systems can still be wrong, but public sources allow the wording, dates, and limits to be checked. The record is checkable. That is the value. The machine did not uncover a secret gospel or a hidden decree proving every tradition. It surfaced a pattern that appears when each source stays inside its limits. Tacitus is not Josephus. Josephus is not Pliny. Pliny is not a disciple. Their differences protect the result. Readers often force the sources into one answer. They want Tacitus to prove the resurrection, Josephus to become a Christian, and Pliny to explain the Trinity. The documents refuse. Tacitus gives Rome's memory of punishment. Josephus gives a Jewish historian's reference point. Pliny gives a governor's encounter with a community. That establishes a historical floor. It does not settle heaven. The human ledger now turns back toward the people Pliny never named. Institutions shaped how texts were copied and taught. Ordinary Christians carried the movement through the pressure that made Rome write about it. Their courage is easy to miss. Pliny gives no portraits, family histories, or graves. Yet before dawn, on a fixed day, they gathered while the air held the night's cold. A hymn rose from people who knew an accusation could reach a governor's desk. They bound themselves against theft, adultery, fraud, and broken trust. Their oath had no political protection. Their conduct had a cost. They were not emperors, bishops, or translators. They were people deciding whether the words sung before sunrise would remain true when Roman incense waited later in the day.
That kind of faith needs no monument. It leaves a trace in a hostile letter. The admiration belongs there, not in an invented martyr's speech, but in the plain fact that an investigator searching for crime heard an ethical oath instead. The governor expected disorder. He found discipline. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account becomes almost tender at that point. The inherited account explains why Christians gathered. Pliny, who did not share their belief, records what their gathering demanded. A song, an oath, a refusal. The record survives because someone wanted to punish them. That should weigh on institutions that speak with too much confidence about controlling ordinary faith. The earliest outside witness did not find Christians asking an office for permission to believe. He found them meeting before dawn, binding themselves to moral conduct and enduring scrutiny. The quiet held.
But institutions also create rules, repeat errors, and allow corrections to arrive after the people harmed by those errors have died. A decree has a signature. A translation has an author. A canon has a date. Yet a correction may arrive in a footnote centuries after old certainty entered the pulpit. No one returns to answer. No one stands beside the altered line. The record changes, and the people who trusted the old wording are told to move on. That is the human ledger. Authority can outlive accountability, and the next file asks what these documents prove when inherited certainty is stripped away. The questions the machine could not answer. 3 source types remain on the table. Tacitus wrote Roman history after the fire. Josephus wrote Jewish history after the war. Pliny wrote provincial correspondence while asking Trajan for instructions. None of them was written to answer every question about Jesus.
That sentence needs to come before every conclusion. Tacitus did not set out to write a biography. Josephus did not compose a Christian confession. Pliny did not investigate Jerusalem, the empty tomb, or the inner meaning of the cross. Their documents were aimed elsewhere. That is not a weakness in the evidence, it is the condition of the evidence. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account gives you different kinds of information. Tacitus shows how Rome remembered Christus and the punishment of Christians. Josephus identifies James through Jesus called Christ and preserves a disputed passage about Jesus himself. Pliny records a Roman governor confronting Christians and their worship. 3 sources, 3 purposes, 3 limits. The machine returned to those limits before making any claim. It placed Tacitus's date beside the events he describes. It separated Josephus's James reference from the Testimonium Flavianum. It marked Pliny's lack of contact with Jesus. Then it traced the path each document took through later transmission. The file became smaller. It also became safer. Tacitus wrote later than the events. The fire of Rome came in 64. The execution connected with Pilate came during Tiberius's reign, decades before Tacitus completed the Annals in the early 2nd century. He was not an eyewitness to Jesus. His passage is a later Roman attestation. That distance matters. It does not erase the name. Tacitus connects Christians to Christus and places his execution under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. That is a historical claim about a movement and its remembered founder. It is not a complete account of Jesus' life. The Roman source gives you no childhood, no Galilean itinerary, no list of teachings, no independent witness to the resurrection. Its silence has a boundary. Josephus creates a different problem. His James reference identifies James as the brother of Jesus called Christ, within a legal account set between the deaths of Festus and the arrival of Albinus. The passage sits inside a political setting that Josephus understood. The Testimonium is separate. Its wording is disputed. Modern textual critics disagree about the exact original form of the Testimonium Flavianum. Many judge that the surviving paragraph was edited in transmission. Some argue that an authentic core about Jesus remains beneath the later Christian phrases. Others debate how much of that core can be recovered. No complete original stands before you. No copyist signed the alteration. The manuscript tradition gives evidence through comparison. Scholars examine Josephus's language, his purpose, the surrounding context, and the ways later witnesses preserve the passage. They ask which parts fit a Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience, and which parts sound like a later Christian declaration. The answer remains contested. That is an honest result. Grok did not pull a hidden original from a damaged archive. It did not announce a percentage for the authentic wording. It identified the point where the evidence becomes uncertain. A damaged paragraph can still preserve a historical core. A disputed sentence can still contain useful evidence. A surviving copy can still carry an editorial scar. Those truths do not cancel one another. Pliny gives you a third limit. He wrote to Trajan around 112 from Bithynia and Pontus. He described Christians, their meetings, their worship of Christ, and the test of recantation. He never met Jesus. He never visited Jerusalem to investigate the execution. He never claims to know whether Christians were right about God, resurrection, or divine identity.
His report begins with accusations in a provincial office, not with an inquiry into the first-century events. The governor knew a movement. He did not know its founder. That distinction matters. The external dossier supports several narrow claims. A historical movement connected itself to Jesus. Roman memory linked Christus to execution under Pontius Pilate during Tiberius's reign. Josephus identified James through Jesus called Christ. Pliny described early Christian worship and moral commitments. The evidence has weight. The weight has limits. The dossier does not independently prove miracles. It does not prove the resurrection. It does not prove divine identity. It does not establish the full content of Christian teaching. No passage in Tacitus answers those questions. No sentence in Josephus settles them. No line from Pliny can carry them across the gap. The documents refuse to become something else. That refusal protects the investigation from exaggeration. It also protects faith from being reduced to a laboratory result. Historical evidence can establish that a person lived, that a movement formed around him, and that outsiders encountered the movement. History cannot force a theological conclusion. The machine cannot cross that boundary. Honestly, this is where many investigations lose their discipline. A source is discovered, then stretched until it appears to prove everything. A skeptical response arrives, then shrinks the source until it appears to prove nothing. Both methods damage the record. The useful question stays narrower. What does each document say? When was it written? What purpose did it serve? How did it reach the present? Which claims survive those tests? The machine's value lies there. It cross-references dates, authors, wording, and limits. It can place Tacitus beside Josephus, Josephus beside Pliny, and Pliny beside Trajan. It can identify where they overlap without pretending that overlap removes every uncertainty. A comparison tool, not an oracle. The difference is physical. An oracle gives a verdict and ends the question. A comparison tool returns marked passages, dates, contradictions, and gaps. It leaves the page open beneath the reader's hand. The paper remains warm from the lamp. The ink remains old. The question remains yours. The number 3 has followed this investigation from the beginning. 3 outsiders: Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny. 3 settings: Rome, Jerusalem, and Bithynia and Pontus. 3 forms of contact: punishment, identification, and administration. 3 does not mean 3 perfect witnesses. It means one inherited account is not the only path into the past. The hostile record versus the inherited Christian account becomes clearer when the sources are not forced to agree. Tacitus gives a Roman memory of a condemned movement. Josephus gives a Jewish reference to Jesus through James. Pliny gives a governor's description of Christians who worshipped Christ. The overlap is narrow. The overlap is real. Now, return to the sentence that has carried so much force. The enemies kept the best records. That phrase is a rhetorical synthesis. It is not a quotation from Tacitus. It does not mean hostile authors were always more accurate than friendly ones. It means their lack of Christian purpose makes certain details harder to dismiss as devotional invention. A hostile author can still repeat an error. A friendly author can still preserve truth. Motive does not decide accuracy by itself. The document must still be tested. Tacitus may have used information available in Rome. Josephus may have preserved a core inside a passage later edited by Christian transmitters. Pliny reported what officials and accused people told him, without personal contact with Jesus. Every source has a chain behind it. Every chain has a weak link. The machine marked those links rather than hiding them. It separated direct wording from interpretation, external attestation from theological meaning, and a historical movement from the truth claims made by that movement. That is why the file can support confidence and restraint at the same time. You can accept that Jesus stands behind the movement called Christian without pretending Tacitus wrote a gospel. You can accept that Josephus knew of James without pretending the Testimonium survived untouched. You can accept Pliny's account of early worship without claiming that a governor proved its divine object. The evidence does not ask you to choose between thought and faith. It asks you to stop making documents carry weight they never promised to carry. Sit with that for a second. A historical floor is not a theological ceiling. It gives you firm ground beneath claims about Jesus, Pilate, James, Christians, and early worship. It does not tell you how high belief may rise. That distinction is where the honest chapter stands. Modern scholars can disagree over the Testimonium's original wording while agreeing that the dispute exists. They can debate how much Josephus wrote while recognizing the separate importance of the James reference. They can question Tacitus's sources while accepting that the Annals preserve a named Roman connection between Christus and Pilate. Disagreement does not erase the archive, it maps the pressure points. The machine also cannot determine whether God acted in history. It cannot decide whether the resurrection occurred. It cannot confirm that any theological claim is divinely true. It can identify what believers claimed. It can identify what outsiders recorded. It can show where the two records meet, no more than that. And yet, the limited instrument exposed a pattern. Across 3 documents, outsiders repeatedly preserve a movement connected to Jesus. Their motives differ, their dates differ, their settings differ. Their wording does not form one polished story, but the core refuses to disappear. That is the pattern institutions had little incentive to state in plain speech. The texts were never secret. Scholars knew their contents. But a scholar has a career, a reputation, a department, a diocese, and inherited boundaries watching the way a conclusion is phrased. The machine has none of those pressures. The next file explains why that absence mattered, and why a limited comparison could expose a pattern that institutions had little reason to state plainly. What remains when the institution is removed? 3 witnesses, 3 motives, not one shared agenda. Publius Cornelius Tacitus, senator and historian, writing in Rome in the early 2nd century, roughly half a century after Nero's fires. He calls the movement a destructive superstition. He still records that Christus suffered the extreme penalty under the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius, that is, a Roman pen, hostile to the faith, placing a named execution under a named governor. It is not an eyewitness account, and it never claimed to be. Titus Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian in Roman service, finishing his Antiquities of the Jews around 93 or 94. In Book 20 he names James, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, condemned during the gap between the death of Festus and the arrival of Albinus, a family relationship inside a dated administrative vacuum. Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia and Pontus around 112, writing to the Emperor Trajan because he did not know the law and would not guess at it. His letter, Book 10, 96. His answer arrived from Trajan: do not hunt them, punish them only if formally accused and unrepentant. Now, here is what nobody tells you about that dossier. It was not a pastor who laid those 3 documents side by side and refused to blur them. It was not a council. It was not a synod, a seminary faculty, or a university committee with a press office. It was a machine, a language model built by a company owned by Elon Musk, cross-referencing dates, authors, wording, and limits with no parish to protect. The machine has no ordination to lose. It has no congregation reading its conclusions on Sunday morning. It has no tenure review, no bishop, no donor list, no publisher asking whether the phrasing might upset the faithful. When it flagged the strong lines, it flagged them flat. When it flagged the damaged ones, it flagged those just as flat. That is the whole trick. That is the only advantage it ever had, and the damaged line still stands there, unresolved. In Antiquities Book 18, Josephus writes of Jesus, and somewhere inside that paragraph, a later Christian hand pressed down. The phrases that call him the Christ and speak like a confession of faith sit uneasily beside the language of a Jewish historian writing for Roman readers. Most modern textual critics judge the passage edited. Many argue a genuine core survives underneath. Nobody can hand you the untouched original because it no longer exists in any manuscript. The copyist who did it left no name, no correction was ever issued. But strip that paragraph out entirely and the file does not collapse. Tacitus remains. The James reference remains. And Pliny's report remains. The one piece of evidence with no theology in it at all, only procedure and observation. Christians in a Roman province meeting on a fixed day before sunrise in the cold, singing a hymn to Christ as to a god, then binding themselves by oath against theft, adultery, fraud, and breaking a trust. A governor wrote that down while deciding how to punish them. He had no reason to flatter them. He was building a case. The enemies kept the best records. That is the epitaph of this whole file. Not because hostile writers are always more accurate. They are not, and Tacitus' contempt is on the page for anyone to read. But because a witness who wants your movement crushed has no motive to invent its existence, no motive to invent its founder, and no motive to invent the execution that started it. The record survived in the hands of people who wished it had not.
Sit with that for a second, especially if you walked into this video worried about what a machine might take from you. It took nothing. The outside record does not touch the resurrection. It does not rule on divinity. It cannot reach into the empty tomb, and it never pretended it could. What it does is narrower and honestly more useful. It shows a first-century Jewish teacher, executed under Pontius Pilate, whose followers were singing to him as to a god within 80 years, in a province 1,500 miles from Jerusalem, under threat of punishment. These texts were never secret. Tacitus sits on library shelves. Josephus has been printed for centuries. Pliny's letter is assigned to Latin students. They were not hidden. They were simply unchosen. Left out of the sermon, left out of the study guide, softened into a footnote. Scholars knew all of it. But a scholar has a career, a reputation, a department, a congregation, and inherited boundaries watching how the sentence gets phrased. The evidence was public. The plain speech was rare. And that is the quiet gift buried in a thin file. Careful evidence is not the enemy of faith. It is armor against institutions that overstate their certainty. The ones who tell you every word is settled, every question closed, every difficult passage already answered on your behalf. The strong documents stay strong under examination. The damaged ones get labeled honestly. Nothing needs to stand between you and either kind. The quiet kept this, not the powerful. Now, before this closes, the argument continues in the comments, and that is where it belongs. Which of the three witnesses hit you hardest? The Roman historian who despised them, the Jewish historian whose sentence was tampered with, or the governor who wrote down their hymn while deciding how to punish them? Drop your answer down there. This conversation matters, and I read everything. If this video showed you something you had genuinely never heard before, give it a like. It makes a real difference to how far a story like this can travel. And subscribe, then turn on notifications, because the next investigation puts the machine directly into the Book of Enoch, the nature of the angels, the fall described in its opening chapters, and the reason a book quoted inside the Epistle of Jude survived complete only in Ge'ez on Ethiopian shelves, while Western Christianity left those pages outside its own. You will not want to miss that one. Ask yourself one thing before you go. If 3 hostile witnesses preserved this much by accident, how much was preserved somewhere nobody thought to look? Pliny's letter is still filed under Book 1096. Go read it before someone explains it to you.